October 7, 1957, 8:42 p.m. The Hotel Teresa, Harlem. The hallway smelled like boiled cabbage and cigarette smoke. The radiator knocked once, then went quiet. Bumpy Johnson stood outside room 212 with his coat still on, hat low, one hand in his pocket. Not for a weapon, but to keep it still. Inside that room, a man named Vincent Chin Gigante was waiting with a gun. Here's what happened. No mystery, no build-up. Chin Gigante pressed a revolver to Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson's skull and pulled the trigger. The gun clicked. No bullet. That click was supposed to end Bumpy Johnson's life. It didn't. And the reason it didn't had nothing to do with luck. It had everything to do with a debt, a lie, and a man who was already deciding whether Bumpy lived or died before he squeezed the trigger. Bumpy hadn't come to the Hotel Teresa for a fight. He came because Albert Anastasia, the boss of bosses downtown, had sent word. Show up alone. No bodyguards, no noise. The message was simple. There was a problem with the numbers money moving through Harlem, and Bumpy was accused of skimming. That accusation was a death sentence if it stuck. Bumpy knew the rules. When the Italians called, you answered. When they asked questions, you didn't raise your voice. And when they told you to step into a room, you stepped. Room 212 had one lamp on, one chair by the window, and Chin Gigante standing too close. Sit down, Chin said. Bumpy didn't. That's when Chin lifted the gun. Not shaking, not angry, calm, professional. This ain't personal, Chin said. This is business catching up. The gun touched Bumpy's head, cold metal, right above the ear. Bumpy didn't beg. He didn't reach. He didn't flinch. Before you pull that, Bumpy said, you should ask who told you I stole. Chin didn't answer. He pulled the trigger. Click. The sound was small. But in that room, it was everything. Chin's eyes changed, just for a fraction of a second, because now the situation was wrong. Guns weren't supposed to fail. Plans weren't supposed to hesitate. Bumpy moved, fast, controlled, knocking the gun aside before Chin could fire again. The revolver skidded across the floor. No punches, no shouting. Just two men staring at each other, both understanding the same thing. If that gun had gone off, Chin would already be explaining a body to Anastasia, and now he had to explain a mistake. You knew, Chin said. Bumpy straightened his coat. I knew you wouldn't load it. That's when the door opened. Not police, not reinforcements. Just a man watching from the hallway who had seen everything, and who wasn't supposed to be there at all. Because the real danger wasn't the gun. It was the fact that someone wanted this meeting to fail, and they'd made sure the bullet wasn't the only thing missing. So the question isn't why the gun didn't fire. The question is, who made sure it wouldn't? The man in the hallway was named Calvin Brooks, 34 years old, married, 2 kids sleeping 3 blocks away in a walk-up with a busted lock, and a landlord who didn't answer calls. Calvin wasn't a gangster, he wasn't a soldier, he was a numbers runner who'd been promoted too fast because he followed instructions and didn't ask questions. Tonight, that was exactly the problem. Calvin stood, frozen near the stairwell, hat in his hands, heart slamming against his ribs. He'd been told to wait outside room 212 and listen. Nothing more. If voices got loud, he was supposed to knock. If the door opened, he was supposed to look down the hall and pretend he hadn't seen anything. But he'd seen everything. He'd seen Chin Gigante raise the gun. He'd heard the click. And he'd seen Bumpy Johnson turn his head and look straight at him after. Not angry, not surprised, just measuring. Calvin felt his mouth go dry. because now he was part of it, and he didn't get a vote. This wasn't even his job. He'd been pulled into it because his brother Leonard was late on a debt. Leonard gambled. Everyone knew it. Lost money he didn't have. Borrowed from the wrong people. Promised it would be fixed by summer. It wasn't. 2 weeks ago, Calvin had been told the debt could disappear if he did a favor. Stand outside a door. Pass along a message. Say nothing afterward. Tonight was supposed to clean the slate. Instead, it cracked it wide open. Inside the room, Chin and Bumpy stood still, the tension thick enough to choke on. Chin glanced at Calvin like he was seeing him for the first time. "You weren't supposed to open the door," Chin said. "I didn't," Calvin answered. "It opened." Bumpy took a step closer. "Who told you to wait out here?" Calvin swallowed. If he said the wrong name, Leonard was finished. If he said nothing, he might be. "Mr. DeLuca," Calvin said finally. "Frank DeLuca." That name landed hard. Frank DeLuca wasn't muscle. He wasn't management. He was an accountant with clean suits and a ledger that never lost $1. He handled disputes quietly, permanently. Bumpy nodded once. Chin's jaw tightened. "So Frank sets the meeting," Bumpy said. "Frank sends you. Frank makes sure the gun's empty." Chin shook his head. "I didn't check it." "That's the point," Bumpy said. Calvin's chest tightened. This wasn't about money anymore. This was about who was setting traps for who. And he was standing in the middle with no cover. Bumpy turned to him. "You got a family, Calvin?" Calvin hesitated. That was the wrong question to answer honestly, but Bumpy already knew. "2 kids, Calvin said. "My wife's sick, asthma, medicine costs." "I didn't ask for details," Bumpy said. "I asked because you're going to have to choose." Chin stepped forward. "This don't concern him." "It does now," Bumpy replied, "because someone used him. And when this goes bad, and it will, they'll blame the easiest body." Calvin felt his knees weaken. He thought of Leonard, of his wife's inhaler running low, of his kids asleep, unaware that their father's silence or honesty could decide whether he came home. "What do you want?" Calvin asked. Bumpy looked at Chin, then back at Calvin. "I want to know," Bumpy said slowly. "Who told Frank DeLuca that tonight was the night?" Silence filled the room. Calvin knew the answer. And if he said it out loud, someone powerful would come looking for him before sunrise. But if he didn't, he'd already seen what happens when plans go wrong. So the question pressing down on him now was simple and brutal. Does Calvin Brooks save his brother? Or save himself? Calvin didn't answer right away. He looked past Bumpy, past Chin, at the closed door of room 212. Thin wood, cheap lock, no escape. Whatever he said next stayed in this room and followed him out of it. "I didn't hear everything," Calvin said carefully. "Just enough to know Frank didn't act alone." Bumpy studied him. "That's not an answer." Chin exhaled through his nose. "Kid, you're in over your head. You say a name, you don't get to take it back." "That's already true," Bumpy said. "Difference is whether he lives long enough to regret it." Calvin felt his palms slick with sweat. He hadn't planned on courage tonight. He'd planned on surviving. There's a difference, and it shows up fast when men stop pretending. "Frank met with someone from your side last week," Calvin said. "Not Harlem, downtown, near Mulberry." Chin's eyes narrowed. "You're saying Italians?" "I'm saying one Italian," Calvin replied. "One who doesn't like owing favors." Bumpy leaned against the dresser. Name. Calvin closed his eyes. Saw Leonard's face the last time he'd promised to quit gambling. Saw his wife coughing at night, pretending she was fine. Salvatore Greco, Calvin said. The air shifted. Greco wasn't a soldier. He was a messenger who'd been waiting too long for a seat at the table. Ambitious, careful, and desperate to prove he could solve problems without getting his hands dirty. Greco doesn't move without permission, Chin said. He did this time, Calvin answered. He told Frank you were ready to make an example, that Harlem needed a reminder. Bumpy let out a low breath. So Greco sets me up as a thief, sends you to watch, gives Chin an empty gun, and waits to see who survives. And if you die, Calvin added, voice tight, the blame lands on Chin. If Chin dies, it lands on you. Either way, Greco looks clean. Chin's face hardened. That son of a... Bumpy raised a hand. Anger later. He turned back to Calvin. You tell anyone else this? No, Calvin said quickly. I swear. Why? Because if I do, Calvin said, my brother disappears. That landed. Bumpy straightened. So this is about leverage. It started that way, Calvin said. Now it's about whether I get to walk out of here. Chin paced the room, every step controlled. You realize if this gets upstairs, nobody cares about your brother, or you. I know, Calvin said. That's why I didn't go upstairs. Bumpy looked between them. Here's the problem. Greco thinks this ends tonight. He's wrong. But if he realizes we know, he'll move fast. Chin stopped pacing. We handle it now. Not like that, Bumpy said. Not loud. Calvin's stomach dropped. What does that mean? It means, Bumpy said, you're going to do exactly what Greco expects. Calvin stared at him. You want me to lie? I want you to survive, Bumpy replied. You go back. You tell Frank the meeting went bad. You tell him Chin panicked. You tell him I barely got out. And my brother? Chin answered this time. Your brother's debt disappears. Calvin blinked. Just like that? Just like that, Chin said. Provided you don't improvise. Calvin hesitated. And if Greco checks? Bumpy stepped closer. Then you tell him the truth, after he's already committed. Calvin felt the weight settle. He wasn't a bystander anymore. He was bait. What if he sees through it? Calvin asked. Bumpy's voice dropped. Then you won't have time to worry. A knock echoed down the hall. 3 sharp taps, not hotel staff. Chin reached for the gun on the floor. Loaded it this time. Bumpy didn't move. Calvin's heart hammered. Because whoever was knocking had no idea the plan had already changed, and if it was Greco's man, then the betrayal wasn't coming later. It was already at the door. The knock came again. Not louder, not impatient, confident. Chin lifted the revolver, eyes on the door. Calvin took half a step back without meaning to. Bumpy stayed where he was, calm in a way that made the room feel smaller. Don't answer, Calvin whispered. Bumpy shook his head. He didn't come to wait. Chin cracked the door just enough to see. A man stood there alone, coat buttoned, hat dry despite the rain outside. Mid-40s, clean shoes, no bulge at the waist, not muscle. Evening, the man said. Mr. Johnson, Mr. Gigante. Calvin's stomach dropped. Frank DeLuca didn't send people like this. He came himself. Frank stepped inside without being invited. Closed the door behind him. Looked at the overturned chair. The gun in Chin's hand. The space where a body was supposed to be. Then he smiled. Well, Frank said, adjusting his cuffs. That didn't go the way Sal promised. The room went dead quiet. Bumpy turned his head slowly. "You're early." "I was curious," Frank replied. "When I didn't hear about a shooting by 9, I figured something had jammed." Chin raised the gun a fraction. "You set this up?" Frank didn't deny it. "I managed it." Calvin felt his throat tighten. This wasn't part of the plan. Frank wasn't supposed to be here yet. He was supposed to wait for news, good or bad, and then decide who to protect. Instead, he'd come to see who was standing. "That gun wasn't supposed to fire," Frank continued. It was insurance. If Bumpy died, Chin takes the fall. If Chin hesitates, Bumpy learns who's useful. Either way, I clean up the mess." Bumpy smiled thinly. "You left out the part where I walk away." Frank shrugged. "I underestimated how much you value being warned." Calvin's heart pounded. He realized then this wasn't Greco's play anymore. Greco was the decoy. Frank DeLuca had been running the table the entire time. "And what about him?" Bumpy asked, nodding toward Calvin. Frank finally looked at Calvin, really looked at him. "Oh, him?" Frank said. "He's why I'm here." Calvin froze. "I told Sal to put a witness in the hall," Frank continued. "Someone small, someone with something to lose. Because if this ended clean, I'd need someone to swear it didn't." Chin snarled. "You used him." "I used all of you," Frank replied calmly. "That's what keeps the books balanced." Bumpy's voice sharpened. "Then you made one mistake." Frank tilted his head. "Which is?" "You came alone," Bumpy said. Frank chuckled. "Did I?" The hallway phone rang. Once, then again. Chin moved to answer. Frank raised a finger. "Don't." Bumpy watched Frank now, fully alert. "Who's on the line?" "Someone who doesn't like waiting," Frank said. "Someone who knows that if I don't pick up, this room becomes very expensive for everyone in it." The phone rang a third time. Calvin felt the walls closing in. This wasn't a standoff, it was a countdown. Frank finally lifted the receiver. "Yes." Pause. "No, he's alive." Another pause. "Yes, I see that." Frank's expression changed. Not fear, not anger. Calculation. "Plans adjust," he said into the phone. "Give me 5 minutes." He hung up. Then he did something no one expected. He pulled a folded envelope from his coat and slid it across the dresser toward Calvin. "Your brother's debt," Frank said. "Paid in full." Calvin stared at it. "What?" "You did exactly what I needed," Frank continued. "You stayed quiet. You watched. You confirmed who could be trusted under pressure." Bumpy's eyes narrowed. "And now?" "Now," Frank said, "I need him to do one more thing." Calvin's voice shook. "I already did what you asked." Frank looked at him kindly. "No, you did what you thought I asked." Chin stepped forward. "You're pushing too far." Frank met his gaze. "I'm correcting an imbalance." He turned back to Calvin. "You're going to leave this hotel. You're going to tell Sal Greco that Bumpy Johnson pulled a gun on you, that Chin hesitated, that I barely stopped a bloodbath." Calvin's breath caught. "That's not what happened." "I know," Frank said. "That's why it'll be believed." Bumpy spoke, low and dangerous. "You do that, you sign his death warrant." Frank shook his head. "No, I sign his promotion. Greco takes the fall. You and Chin stay useful. And Calvin here gets to keep his family." Calvin looked between them. The envelope, the door, the phone, silent now. He realized the twist too late. There was never a choice between loyalty and survival. Frank had decided who lived before the gun ever clicked. And now Calvin had to decide something else entirely. Was he willing to lie, or was he willing to be erased? Because if he refused, this room wouldn't need a gun at all. Calvin picked up the envelope. It was heavier than paper should be. Not because of cash, because of what it represented. Safety, bought and sealed by a story that wasn't true. His fingers trembled. "I do this," Calvin said, voice low, "and Sal Greco disappears." Frank nodded, quietly. "And if I don't?" Frank didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. Bumpy did. "If you don't," Bumpy said, "your brother's debt comes back with interest, and next time they won't need a witness." Calvin looked at Bumpy then. Really looked. Not the man with the reputation, not the figure people whispered about, but a man who understood the cost because he'd paid it before. "This is what it always comes to," Calvin said. "Someone smaller gets crushed, so the math works out." Frank smiled thinly. "That's an unkind way to put it." "It's an accurate one," Calvin replied. The silence stretched. Chin lowered the gun. Not because he trusted Frank, but because shooting him wouldn't fix what was already set in motion. Calvin slid the envelope into his coat. "I'll say it," he said. "I'll tell Greco exactly what you want him to hear." Frank straightened his cuffs. "Good, you're learning." Bumpy stepped closer to Calvin. "Listen to me. Once you say it, there's no correcting it. You won't be a witness anymore. You'll be the reason." Calvin nodded. "I know." He turned toward the door and stopped. "But understand this," Calvin said, not turning back. "Every time you look at your books, you'll know one number doesn't add up." Frank raised an eyebrow. "Which one?" "Me," Calvin said. Frank didn't reply. Calvin opened the door and walked into the hallway. The air felt colder. The carpet muffled his steps like it was already trying to forget him. Inside the room, no one spoke for a full minute. Finally, Chin broke it. "You letting him walk?" Bumpy answered without hesitation. "He already paid." Frank glanced at Bumpy. "You think this ends clean?" "No," Bumpy said. "I think it ends later." Frank smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Later favors people who plan." "So does memory," Bumpy replied. Frank paused at the door. "You survived tonight." Bumpy held his gaze. "So did you." Frank left. The room felt emptier than before. Chin exhaled. "Greco won't see it coming." Bumpy shook his head slowly. "That's what worries me." Because somewhere between the lie Calvin was about to tell and the truth Frank believed he controlled, something had already slipped loose. And when it came back around, it wouldn't ask permission. By morning, the story had legs. Not the truth, the version that moved fastest. Sal Greco had overreached. That was the whisper. He'd tried to orchestrate a hit without clearing it properly. He'd panicked when it went sideways. He'd embarrassed people who didn't like being embarrassed. By noon, Greco wasn't answering his phone. By dusk, no one expected him to. Calvin Brooks spent that day at his kitchen table, hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee. His wife breathed steadily in the bedroom. His kids argued quietly over cereal. The world hadn't ended. That was the worst part, because nothing looked different. Leonard called just once. "They said it's done," he whispered. "I'm clear." Calvin closed his eyes. "Good." He didn't ask where Sal Greco was. Across Harlem, the streets adjusted. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a slight shift in who crossed the street first, who waited before speaking, who checked behind them twice instead of once. Bumpy Johnson didn't celebrate. He didn't retaliate. He let the silence do the work. Downtown, Frank DeLuca's books balanced again. One problem removed. 2 alliances stabilized. 1 witness folded neatly back into the crowd. Efficient. Too efficient. Because something else spread with the rumor, something Frank hadn't planned. People talked about the gun. Not the attempt, the failure. They talked about how Chin Gigante pulled the trigger and nothing happened. About how Bumpy Johnson didn't flinch. About how a meeting designed to end one described man had somehow ended another without a shot fired. That detail stuck. It didn't make Bumpy larger. It made the situation narrower, more dangerous. When violence fails, it doesn't disappear. It waits. Chin felt it first. People are asking questions, he told Bumpy days later, about who loaded the gun. Bumpy nodded. They should. And Frank? He thinks the problem's solved, Bumpy said. That's his weakness. Meanwhile, Calvin went back to running numbers. Same routes, same faces, different weight in his chest. He noticed how often men tested him now, asked small questions, watched his answers. He'd been promoted without being told. Witnesses always are. One night as he locked up, a stranger passed him on the stairs and said quietly, "Careful what stories you tell." Calvin didn't turn around. He didn't have to. The streets weren't celebrating a shift. They were waiting. Because everyone understood one thing now. If a gun could fail in a room like that, then the rules weren't as solid as they pretended. And when rules crack, someone always gets cut. The only question left was who would bleed next. 3 months later, Calvin Brooks quit. No announcement, no explanation. He sold his route, paid off what little he owed, and took a job loading trucks on the night shift. Less money. No decisions. Just work that ended when the clock said it did. It didn't save him. One cold evening as he walked home, a man stepped out of a parked car and said his name, not loud, not threatening, just enough to make Calvin stop. "Frank keeps neat books," the man said, "but he hates loose ends." Calvin understood then. He'd survived the meeting. He'd survived the lie. What he hadn't survived was being remembered. They found him the next morning with no marks, no struggle, no story to tell. Downtown, the books stayed clean. Uptown, Bumpy Johnson heard the news and said nothing. He didn't need to. He'd known how it would end the moment Calvin picked up that envelope. The irony wasn't that the gun failed. It was that the click everyone remembered wasn't the sound that killed anyone. It was the one that proved silence could be just as final. If you want the next story, one where the choice goes the other way, subscribe. Because not every click stays quiet.